I'd like to speak just for, if it's possible, for 10 or 15 minutes on the Western civilization, and then the crisis, why there's a crisis, and then what happened, and if there's any hope. But I'll just preface it. I was talking to a friend at Hillsdale once, not once, just in September, and he says, you know, I can't watch the NBA anymore. And I said, well, I don't watch and I haven't watched an NFL game. I don't want to, that's an escape. I don't want to be lectured when I turn on TV. And he said, Major League Baseball's gone. So we were, and then he said, have you been to a movie lately? I said, why would I want to watch a poor remake of a Hollywood? There's not an idea in that whole city. So then he said, do you care whether there's a firewall for the New York Times? I said, I haven't read it in 5 years. He said, I haven't read the Washington Post. He said, have you watched network news? I said, I don't even know what it is anymore. And he said, when people come to Hillsdale, does it make much difference if they have a PhD from Stanford or Harvard? I said, no, I'd rather talk to somebody in Fresno. So what he was saying is that we all are having a monastery of the mind. We've withdrawn from all of these wonderful institutions, and we've said to ourselves, I can't take part in it. These were created by great people who are dead, but they've been corrupted, all of them. And it's very difficult now, because I always say to my wife, we get up one morning and we see this chaos on the screen, on the internet, outside our front door. And I say, we're Augustan and we're living in Carthage about 440 AD, and the Vandals are outside the walls, metaphorically. And it's a very difficult time to be alive. I have a lot of empathy for people who get up every morning and they go out there and they're undaunted. But what is most upsetting is this civilization that gives us such freedom, such material bounty, security, luxury, and then it creates such disdain for it. It was almost as if, well, we want all of the bounties of this civilization, we want all of these golden eggs, and we want to strangle this goose. And I'd like to suggest to you in the next 10 minutes, that's the only reassuring thing that's not new. And it's caught up in the contradictions of our very civilization. So what we call the West is just, why wasn't the East? Because the Greeks had no problem about being ethnocentric. 7th and 8th century BC, they got up in the morning and they said everything they noticed that seems to set where the sun was, everything over there was like them, and everything where the sun rises, the Oriens or the Orient, was different. They decided the world was them versus Persia. And the Occidentals, where the sun set in the West, was a different culture. They were pretty prescient. And so out of nowhere, about 800 BC, we had these 1,500 city-states, only about 1.5 million people and 50,000 square miles, very small place. They were tried to be strangled by the Persians that had a kingdom of 30 million people and could not. And these 1,500 city-states started to reject all of the contemporary premises, the dynastic civilizations in Egypt, the birth of civilization in the Near East, the tribal cultures of Europe, nothing to do with race. My ancestors in Sweden were killing each other and doing all sorts of things the Greeks would have thought barbaric. And out of this culture, they started to have a system of law, inheritance. I think you could say that constitutional government was birthed in Greece around 750, not for equality, not for freedom, but for the protection of property and to be able to hand it down without government interference to your family. Something we take for granted, but that was the spark that made people create these constitutional governments. And then the rest followed over the next 150 years. Consensual government, rule of law rather than people. Free market economies, very primitive, but still free market and private property. Rationalism, the ability to explain natural phenomenon without resort to superstition or religion. Didn't mean that they weren't religious, they just said there's an element that we can't explain scientifically, that's mystery. It's a good Greek word. But the rest of the world, why the sun comes up in a certain way and sets in a certain way, the stars, what's water and earth, and all of that can be explained without superstition. And for a country that was very close to starvation, it was always one harvest away from annihilation, they were very enlightened. We say, well, we're a sexist civilization. Compared to what? Compared to Egypt? Compared to the Goths? I mean, if you look at the titles of plays in Greece, the Antigone, the Helen, the Andromache, the Trojan women, they're heroes. Lysistrata. So they were already talking about the equality of the sexes. You say, well, they had slavery. Every society in the world had slavery. Nobody at this time had anybody like Alcidamas who said, no man is born a slave. And that was a topic of intense debate. And then there was this idea of self-criticism. We'll get back to that later. But you had the right to critique the very system you created without fear of retribution. Now, this was not set in stone. There were revolutions. There were people who tried to destroy it. But that was the contribution to the West from Greece. When Rome took over, because they had no word in their vocabulary, natio, the equivalent in Greek, there was no nationhood. How can you preserve a civilization when there's 1,500 city-states? You can do it if you're Alexander the Great, but you have to destroy freedom in the process. He didn't destroy all of West, but Rome took over the Mediterranean, and they added to this menu, this formula. And one of the things they did was create a tripart system of government. And this is very important because our founders did not want an Athenian-style democracy where on any given day the assembly could do whatever they wanted when 51% of the people said, let's kill all the Mityleneans today, they've been bad. And then they said, yeah, it's a good idea. They got up the next morning and said, that was kind of extreme. I'm quoting basically Thucydides. So the next morning they got up and said, let's not kill them. They said, well, we already sent the ship out. So I said, well, we'll give volunteers and give them free food and a bonus, maybe. And we have this great scene in the history where they're all got their necks ready to be cut, and somebody comes in and says, stop, just cut 1,500 necks, not everybody. And so that's what scared the Romans. So they had a tripart system, 2 consuls and executive, and then they had tribal assemblies, a lower house, and the Senate, same as ours, Senate. And then they had tribunals that were a judiciary, very influential on Montesquieu and the French Enlightenment. And they codified law, and they had basic, in other words, they took the spirit of the Greeks and they said it doesn't work, it doesn't apply to every day. What happens if you're arrested? You have to have habeas corpus. And most of our law today is Latinate, not Greek, because the Romans were wonderful codifiers. And most important, they were wonderful assimilators. This was the only civilization in the world said that you do not have to be Italian to be Roman by the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. And by 80 AD, there was not going to be any more Italian emperors. In other words, Rome became not what Joe Biden said. What Joe Biden said the other night, America was an idea. No, it is a reality. It's not was an idea. There wouldn't be a Europe today if it was an idea. Somebody had to reify that idea and go over in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, etc. But Rome was a concept that you could be Roman and not have to look Italian. Very radical idea. That if you accepted Romanness, so if you were a Gaul and you were conquered by the Romans, they didn't just say, we're going to take over and destroy you. They said, we will allow your children to wear togas and they can speak Latin and they can become Roman. That's a pretty radical idea at the time. And there was a final component in this menu, and of course that was Jerusalem. And that was the idea that by the 1st century AD, there was a new element that challenged classical morality. Classical morality was you be no better friend, there's no better friend and no worse enemy. There's no such thing as turn the other cheek. There's no such thing as Sermon on the Mount. If you're a good Greek or a good Roman, you punish your enemies and help your friend. And that's the definition of your morality. And this new idea comes in very revolutionary because it transcended class and hierarchy and status and said, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. And if you're the historian like Gibbon, you say, well, this caused the fall of Rome because how can you run a country on land? Or if you're Gibbon in your writing about the fall of Constantinople, and he says, the people on the walls are getting penance to ask forgiveness to kill Muslims, and the Muslims below are being challenged, being promised 72 virgins in heaven for every Christian they kill, and that's a very asymmetrical incentive. So how can you defeat people like that? So there was a problem already in classical. I'm just telling you about the formation because some of these contradictions are coming to the fore. And so when we look at the critiques of the West, it goes something like this. And this goes back to Greek critics. Thucydides is very critical of democracy. Tacitus, Petronius the novelist, Suetonius the biographer, they had very tough things to say about Roman civilization. And they all said, you create so much bounty with free market capitalism, so much competition and the good envy, not just the bad envy, but the envy of emulation that makes people want to excel. You create excess, they called it luxus, or word for luxury. And you give the people so much protected liberty and freedom, they don't always get up in the forum or the agora or the ecclesia and want to talk about a dialogue of Plato. They want sometimes get up and say, he should be executed because I don't like the way he looks, free speech. And so in a lot of the, I call them the nihilistic tradition, and you know it really took hold in Germany with Oswald Spengler or Nietzsche or Hegel. They said the problem with the West is when you're very free and you're very wealthy, you're very successful. It's not its failure. I mean, after all, ask yourself, in 480, just 17 city-states were left. They had an army no longer bigger than 50,000 people, and they defeated 400,000 Persians coming from the north at Salamis and Plataea. Fast forward 150 years later, and now they're much wealthier. They have a much larger army and navy in the 4th century, and they can't stop 30,000 motley northerners under Philip of Macedon, and then they lost their freedom. The enemies that Rome faced at Cannae or at Zama compared to the Goths and the Vandals were a joke compared to Hannibal in the Punic Wars. But something had happened in that interim. And that's something we have to be very careful because the anecdote to it is important. So we're all very wealthy. We're the wealthiest generation in civilization's history. We're the freest. We can do almost anything we want next to technology. But how in the West, when you have all of those choices and liabilities, what prevents people from going out and saying, fry pigs in a blanket, or trying to attack a police thing, or throwing a Molotov cocktail in a thing, or putting just the most deplorable pornography on the internet, or attacking a Christian for his... What stops a person from doing that in the West? It's legal. You have the money and the time to do it. One of the things that was so striking about all of these BLM and Antifa demonstrations that everybody would say to them, do they have to work? How can they, no, they don't. There's enough bounty. What Milton Friedman once said, yeah, the country's going to hell, but there's a lot of rot in this country. And I think he was channeling something that Adam Smith said. There's a lot of rot in capitalism that when people say it can't go on, it does go on more than you think. We're a lot more successful than we think. And we have a lot of people who died and created a lot of institutions and protocols and histories for us to follow. And they're dead, but that fumes from their lives are still there. So it takes a lot to destroy it. We're doing our best, but it's taking a lot longer than the destroyers want. And so the anecdote to that was, traditionally in the West, there was an anecdote. Plato talked about it, Aristotle talked about it, Thucydides implied it, Tacitus was and of course the New Testament. And the anecdote was, you don't really have to do what you're legally able or financially or economically able to do. And you don't have to do that because you have pressures. You have pressures, you don't want to disgrace your parents or your grandparents or your family name, or you belong to a religion, Christianity. And Christianity says, what you do in this world, you have a soul. You may not think you have a soul, but you do have a soul. And there is going to be a reckoning in the hereafter. So don't do what you're capable of doing. Don't harm other people. Don't harm your soul. And there's also a community. and you don't want to be disgraced. We're talking about a shame culture rather than a guilt culture. Rather than private guilt alone, we had a shame culture in the West. And so traditions, family, religion, community, all of these things, and also public pressures. So if you made money and you were very successful, we said, we're not going to have the government take it from you. There had been efforts to do so in Greece and Rome in the Middle Ages through this project I talked about, went into Europe in the Middle Ages, and then we had the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, Reformation, and then the French Revolution, American Revolution. But through all this period, we rejected the idea that government can take what you created and say it's own, that you owe it to someone else. There was always an equality of opportunity and not an equality of result. But incumbent on the equality of opportunity that individuals could make better decisions how to help people than the government could. And so all of those together restrained human behavior. And what's happened now is, I think we have created so much leisure and so much capital and so much affluence that what we call poor today is richer than any time in the history of the world. I was talking to a guy not too long ago at Walmart in Selma, and he got out of his car in a brand new Kia. And he was very proud. He'd come from Mexico, and he was showing me all the things on a Kia. And I said, you know, everything on that car has more than a Mercedes did 15 years ago. And then I pulled out my iPhone, and I said, I have more power over the world or more information about it than a person with a mainframe IBM that was a billionaire. And so we forget just how much the individual has at his fingertips. And so it's very incumbent that we have these bridles, that we don't abuse it. And we're losing them. And why are we losing them? I'd like to finish maybe with three or four, maybe six if I have time, elements that show you why this Western project is at peril. And some of them are pre-modern. That is, they're not sophisticated. And some of them are postmodern. And they're the cynicism and the nihilism of the elites. The first thing is we're becoming, let's face it, a lot of us are peasants. Until Donald Trump's arrest of middle-class incomes, we had stagnant middle income growth. We could argue that, I think it's fair to argue that something went wrong when we piled up $1.6 trillion of student debt. Well, we have a whole generation of students that are not marrying in their early 20s, or not having children in their early 20s, or not buying a home in their early 20s, all of the catalysts for conservatism that takes yourself away from the equation. So I have to sacrifice for my spouse. I have to sacrifice for my children. I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got to buy a car. Those kids that are out there on the street at Antifa, every time they get arrested, I read the arrest records, and they pretty much fit a stereotype. They're sort of a pajama boy life of Julia Arrested development. And part of it is our society, but part of it is they went to college, they got a student loan for a couple $100,000. The university took no moral hazard. They gave them a therapeutic curriculum that was pretty much worthless. Remember what AOC was before she was a barista? And she was an honor student with a master's. And she thought she was brilliant. She didn't even know what the map of the Middle East was. She'd had a master's from Boston University, and she was very bitter that she had student loans. So the university needs to take moral hazard, but we have weakened the middle class. And I think part of the problem that a lot in the Republican Party didn't see was a confused cause and effect. I'm not trying to excuse the behavior of the lower middle class. We know that in terms of divorce and illegitimacy, drug use, it's epidemic. But that's not necessarily because one day people in 1965 said, I want to take drugs and divorce my wife. It also had something to do that we hollowed out the industrial section of we didn't invest in people the way that we should have. But whatever the causes are, we have kind of weakened the middle class, and without a middle class, you have a peasant culture of people that are subsidized on the bottom and very wealthy on the top. And in a vibrant society, you have middle-class people who are fluid and becoming wealthy, and we all love that. We don't want to become like Europe, where we have static classes. And most people who are wealthy are inherited classes that have levers of government at their access. The second thing is we're becoming tribal. And that means that we feel that our race is essential rather than incidental to who we are. Once we went down that road, I mean, America is the only multiracial democracy that's ever been attempted. You could argue that Rome was, or you could argue the Ottoman Empire, but they had levers of coercion that we don't have. We had the melting pot of assimilation, integration, intermarriage. And I know that each population that was closer to the appearance of the founders was a little bit, snooty, snobbish about the newcomers. Irish people, there was a discussion in 1848 in the New York Tribune whether Irish were human or not. So each immigrant group has had to assimilate and integrate and face terrible oppression. But the idea was you became American. And yes, you enriched the country with your food, your music, your fashion, but you didn't touch the core. You didn't touch the Constitution, you didn't touch the idea of free speech, you didn't touch the idea of free religion. But somewhere in the 1960s, in this effort to make up for discrimination or racism, which were endemic, we decided to abandon that project and start to identify by who we are. I think when Barack Obama came into power, he did something I don't think anybody recognizes, but it was the most deleterious thing in my life that any president's done. He took the binary of the unique African American experience, which was like no other minority. And that binary had been something that binary since the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement had been something the United States was working and succeeding in. And he said that it's not just black versus white, it's everybody who is non-white. They're part of a collective. And all of a sudden, I noticed that people who were rich farm owners with 10,000 acres from the Punjab, or a third-generation Japanese optometrist, or a upper middle-class professor from Brazil was telling me that he was diverse. And all of a sudden, they were part of this group, and we were all going to find some type of edge. So we had, Elizabeth Warren saying she was Native American. We had Rachel Dolezal saying she was black, and it became kind of a parlor game among friends of mine. They said, your children have Oklahoma blood in them. Maybe they're Cherokee. Why don't you take a DNA and they can get a little edge? Everybody was trying to find some edge. And it shows you how racist we've become because, as you know, in the old South, everybody was doing the opposite. Everybody was scared stiff that somewhere in their past they had black blood, and they had 1/16 was the rule, one drop. If you could trace a African American, then you were considered African American. Now we've gone back to the Confederate idea and just flipped it. But it's still racist. And so we're becoming a nation of tribes, and I don't know how we're all going to get along if we give our first loyalty to our first cousin or to somebody that looks like us rather than, and when I heard Joe Biden and all of those candidates do, welcome to the LGBT community, welcome to this community, welcome to this, they never say welcome to as people. And it's not coming from, I don't think it comes from people who classify themselves as non-white, it comes from very elite white people. And I have a theory that the elite liberal is very guilty because they don't feel comfortable with people who don't look like them and are not from their same class. So they've created a middle idea of penance. I'm going to put my kids in an elite academy, and I don't want any minorities near me, but I don't want charter schools. I'm going to build a big wall around my Zuckerberg estate, but don't put a wall down. That's racist down by the border. And you can see what that, it psychologically allows you to be segregated by being abstractly moral and concretely amoral. So we're tribal people now, and there's no society, whether it's the Balkans or Rwanda, we know where that goes. We know what we have a destiny with, because everybody to survive will start being tribal. I go to Walmart, I live in a community that's 85% Latino. I don't know very many white people anymore, they mostly moved away. But at Walmart, for some strange reason, before 8 o'clock in the morning, it's all white, the vestigial population. And for the first time in my life, I walk in, and here's what happens. People don't know me. Hi, how are you? Hey, good to see you. And what they're doing is they're identifying with a shared whiteness because they feel the whole society is becoming tribal. And they're going to adopt by tribe. And I'll say to some, I don't know who you are. Why would I feel closer to that person because he happens to be white than a Mexican-American person who's conservative and shares my own view? But if that's where we're headed, and when history teaches us, once we go tribal, it's like going nuclear. Once one nation goes nuclear, one people goes tribal, everybody's going to go tribal for defense. It happens like that. The work of a multiracial, unified culture takes centuries. The work of a multicultural, divisive culture can happen in 2 or 3 years. Read Thucydides if you don't believe me. And then I think it's very important to realize that not only are we becoming peasants and tribal people, we're becoming residents. Used to be citizenship meant a lot of things. If you were a U.S. citizen, you were inside the United States, you could alone vote, you could alone hold office, you had a U.S. passport, that gave you alone the right to leave the country and come back in on your terms. We had secure borders. Citizenship meant something. Citizenship, we have 50 million people here that are residents. Half of them are legal. I have no problem with green card. Half of them aren't. We have sanctuary cities that have taken up a Confederate idea. Confederate, that they can nullify any law that they don't like. Federal immigration, I don't want to, doesn't matter. Under the federal system, you can't do that. Can't do that. What's going to stop Provo, Utah from saying, you know what? I hate those damn 3 spotted lizards. They're on the federal endangered species. I'm going to crush every one at a workplace. I don't follow federal environmental law. Or how about somebody in Cody, Wyoming, and says, I'm going to start passing an ordinance that says anybody in my town can buy a weapon and walk out the same day. Maybe it'd be good, but it would violate federal law. Exactly what we're doing with sanctuary cities. The left would go crazy if their principles were applied to themselves. It's not a sustainable proposition. And then finally, on the postmodern side, these assaults that are every day about tribalism and we're just residents rather than citizens, and we're peasants rather than citizens. If you notice on the other side, we have all of these elites who don't think they're American at all. They think they're citizens of the world. Michelle Obama, the other day, along with Laura Bush, said, we're citizens of the world. We're here to raise money for the WHO. The WHO, that was basically a megaphone for communist China to lie about the spread of the virus, is unaccountable to no one. I don't want to, nihil dicere de mortuis nisi bonum, don't say anything about the dead unless it's good. But come on, Justice Ginsburg said, I think we have a lot to learn from the South African Constitution. We don't have anything to learn from the South African Constitution. But there are a lot of our elites who feel that on climate change or race relations or tax, they love the European model, or they feel that the Davos man is their symbol. And they have disdain for what they call the deplorables, the irredeemables, the clingers. I think Joe Biden called them the dregs of society. And so our elite is not invested in this country, but in cosmopolitanism. That's a good Greek word for citizens of the world. So and it does filter down. You go to a university, I once spoke at UC Santa Barbara, and I said, there's not a single course here on the Civil War. Not one of you in this audience can tell me what happened at Shiloh. Does anybody? I said, I will get off this stage and leave if one person can tell me what the Battle of Shiloh was. Nobody could. And then a professor got very angry and interrupted. She said, we have a course, I teach it. And I said, I can imagine what it's called. And she said, well, it's called Race and Gender and Post-Civil War America. I said, that doesn't count. Sorry. But we have an elite that's not invested in our traditions and doesn't see us as exceptional. Barack Obama said we're no more exceptional. Joe Biden said it the other day, that America was just an idea. Besides that, we have what I would call evolutionaries. These are people who feel that the Constitution has to be changed because it was created by a bunch of ossified, calcified white mediocrities around 1787. And human nature changes that, according to them. You give people enough money and enlightened leadership, they change, they metamorphosize. So what are we doing right now? Well, after 233 years, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Nobody understood what the founders said. They said it's the only way to keep a rural population, give it some equity with an urban population, because rural values are different. They always will be, and they provide a needed remedy to the mob in town. They said if you're going to have election fraud, you can't destroy an entire election because you outsource each state through the Electoral College, and it's absolutely true. I don't really care this. I think everybody's going to steal elections in California, New York. I'm very worried about the California Congressional District because of that, but I am less worried about the national election being stolen because we have other states that have Electoral College procedures. They want to pack the court. That's not in the Constitution, but it's been there for 150 years. Last time we tied in 1937, remember, when they say they're going to create a commission, it wasn't just the Supreme Court, it was 200 federal judges that Roosevelt wanted to pack. And it was very effective. Everybody said, well, you know what? Even his Democrats stopped that crazy idea of 15. They did, but if you look at New Deal legislation, the court folded after that. They approved everything because they had a sword of Damocles hanging over them. Even if they don't quite get it, the court, John Roberts will tell the conservative members, you better be careful, they're going to pack the court. That's the point. It's a deterrent element. It's a deterrent weapon, even if you can't get it through. But they will, because they're going to eliminate the 170-year tradition of the filibuster. So that on a 51%, if they get a Senate majority and a presidency, they can do whatever they want. I think if we looked at what the Second Amendment is and the First Amendment, they're almost unrecognizable what the founders intended. When I was growing up, there was something called the free speech area. Remember Mario Salvio at Berkeley? Radical idea you could go out and be actually on a place in the campus where no one could censor you. A lot of pornography, a lot of profanity, but it was something we could at least disagree on. And now, if I go to Stanford, you can't say anything like that. Trigger warning, safe spaces based on race. So we've destroyed the First Amendment on campuses, and I think all of you at work know that if you want to wear your MAGA hat to work, you've been in trouble, despite your First Amendment rights. Even if you were said, you know what, I'm not going to go into my private employer who has a right to have certain decorum, I'll be in the parking lot. That still would be dangerous. If you got into a public park and you said you're going to vote for Donald Trump, I don't think you'd be safe in Fresno. So we're already eroding and these evolutionary. There's a third elite assault, and that's what, it's an overused word, but come on, it's the administrative state. We have thousands of people who feel that they have the power of government on their side. If they're federal prosecutors and they want to go after Carter Page or Scooter Libby or Conrad Black, they have unlimited resources. And they target particular people, and they run up for the idea that they're going to run up huge legal bills, and then they're going to have to plea bargain, and there won't be a matter of guilt or innocence, and they do that all the time. We have bureaucrats that, most of you are businessmen, you know more about regulation than I do. When I started farming, there was one rule in 1980 about how you could pack fruit. When I quit in 1992, there were 17 of them on the wall. And you know regulators better than I do. If you're a person who's pretty bright, and you want to go into government with a good pension, a pretty good salary, and you're regulating people who take risk, and they're pretty confident, and they're type A personalities, you know the psychological mechanisms involved, you get even with them by saying, oh, wow, you may own this and this and this, but I can do this and this to you because I have the power of the government. So regulation is another part of this deep state. The most scary thing is if you look at the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, what we've created a whole elite echelon that feel that, and I'll include the retired military, some of my good friends in it, they feel that they're so well connected in New York and Washington, and they're so much part of the bipartisan spirit of the age, that because Donald Trump is crude, they have a moral right to try to undermine him. So when you have a general that's a retired general on a pension in direct violation of Article 82 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, saying, as McCaffrey did, that our president is Mussolini and he should be removed, or Admiral McRaven, the great admiral, I was at the Naval Academy when he would visit, says he should be removed sooner Then later, or you have General Hayden saying that the cages on the border or Auschwitz, or you have my friend Jim Mattis saying Trump is using Nazi-like tactics, and you have an entire retired military in revolt. And the greatest irony is, who gave us the code of uniform military conduct? The left. And why did they do it? Because during the Korean War, they despised who? General Douglas MacArthur. And they said, we're never going to have a general pontificate like MacArthur did and Curtis LeMay did and George Patton did. So we're going to say if they are retired even, they're subject to this code. When I grew up, it was always the right-wing general. Remember him in the cartoon with the sunglasses and the epaulets, 7 Days in May, all of the threat. No, the danger now from the military is much greater, because over the rank of colonel, people are very, very left-wing, and there's no audit or there's no deterrent toward their behavior, because the media encourages it and sees them now not as villains but as heroes. And so let me just conclude by saying we had a wonderful civilization. We do have a wonderful civilization. It had intrinsic weaknesses that we all have to be aware of. It requires sober and judicious self-restraint, and there's always this tendency to take self-criticism to a level that I think we could call nihilism or self-destruction. We don't have to be perfect to be good, and we surely can't go back and look at our ancestors women who had to be pregnant about 10 times in the 19th century or 18th century to have about 6 pregnancies that came to term, to have about 4 deliveries that were successful, in many cases to have 2 or 3 kids that survived. And the idea that they were being oppressed because they had to work by some person who spent 80 to 90 hours a week, her husband, to just produce food. When we had 99 of 100 people farming when this country was founded, now we have about half of one person. So we don't ever apply the code of conduct of a postmodern, wealthy, secure society and go back through society. And rather than say it's tragic, say it's melodramatic, and we're going to pick winners and losers according to how well they are adjudicated to our code of behavior, because there is such a thing called hubris and nemesis. And as sure as we're here tonight, a generation 50 years from now may say, you know what, those people in 2020 were really hypocritical. They were killing fetuses that were they weren't fetuses, they were babies, and they knew they were babies, and they were killing them, and they were so self-righteous about it. We could say so many things that we do. And so with that spirit, I think we all, each according to our stations, have to protect the society, and within our own self, realize how wonderful but how fragile it's been through history. And we have to be careful when we see people attacking it, and we know our vulnerabilities about the society, and it's not from weakness, it's from its ability to create wealth and freedom and art and music. Everybody wants to be a part of it, but it won't last unless we all protect it and defend it. Thank you very much.
Victor, it was actually in Jackson's introduction, but he made a comment I'd like you to elaborate on about this distinction between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And I wonder if I'm oversimplifying to say that perhaps the great tension that we face right now is not just for the West, but it is which revolution is going to win. Are we dealing in the social unrest with the principles of Rousseau and Voltaire versus those of us who are sons and daughters of the American Revolution? I think there's a historical context to the question and an ideological one. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
We have to remember that our revolution, there had never been a revolution like it before or since. It was not a holistic revolution as we usually term it. It was a political revolution to allow people to have consensual government, taxation without representation, but the operative word was liberty and freedom, limited government. Nobody had ever done that before. The French Revolution that occurred roughly a decade later was very different in 2 ways. It was an equality of result, not of opportunity, not liberty. Remember in the French, egalitarianism, fraternity, liberty. egalitarianism. So the French thought that they were going to remake society. Now the problem with that is, if you go to that next step, as our founders said throughout the Federalist Papers, if you go to that next step and say, I'm not just going to make people have equal opportunity, but damn it, I'm going to make them equal, the way the Bolsheviks thought, or Mao thought, or the French Revolution, then people are not equal. Everybody in this room has different health conditions. Everybody has different pursuits, different inheritances, different luck. And if I want to make you all equal, I have to do it on the back end with a level of coercion. And I have to say, I'm going to take you're worth $100 million, and God, I can't see how you can not miss 10 million of that. And I'm going to take 10 million of them, and I'm going to give it to you. But and you're going to say, I'm not going to let you do that. And I'm going to say, I'm morally superior to you, and I'm going to have the force to do it. And we know what the effect of giving me 10 million would do. It'd probably wreck my life. So the point I'm getting at is that the French Revolution was holistic. They even they tried to really do every aspect of it. 1791 became year zero. The days of the month were changed. The days of the week were lengthened from 7 to 10 days. They destroyed the monastery. They killed over 40,000 nuns and monks. The Jacobins, the idea, they put a statue, and they worshiped what? The god reason. The supreme deity was not religious in nature, it was the intellect, supposedly. So it was an effort, 360 degrees. Does this sound familiar, what we're trying to do now? We're going to change every single language. We're going to tear down monuments. This is exactly what the French did. Tear down monuments, change it. I'm at Stanford, and I think Father Serra was a heroic individual if you actually read about his life, given the conditions of founding mission. So I looked out of my window one day, and I saw a guy taking down the Serra Plaza right out. They named it. And then they just took David Jordan, first president, renamed the hall. And I said to a student, well, why don't you go the full thing and get rid of Stanford? He said more things that you would call racist about Asians than Father. Oh, no, we can't do that. See, so it's opportunistic. Nobody wants to graduate from Chumash University. So it all becomes iconic and symbolic. And so the French Revolution was holistic, and it was a quality of result.
There's a couple questions I'm going to sort of merge together that I think have a similar theme. But obviously, it being a largely faith-based audience, and our high school being very rooted not only in Western civilization, but specifically the Christian tradition and a distinctly view of Christian philosophy, do you believe that the West can be preserved without a uniquely Christian orientation?
I don't. Because I know,
Amen.
I think I understand human nature, and human nature being what it is. When you worship only the God reason, and you're highly educated, and you become quite rhetorical, you're always going to find a way to outsmart yourself and to offer an apology for your behavior or apology for an idea, whereas as Aquinas or Augustine reminded us that once you have an absolute, and the founders knew that, then there's a limit there. It stops, and if you believe you can explain all natural phenomenon by science, you're in for a sad life. I can tell you that science will tell us why when we get out in that parking lot our car will start, and why it works, but it won't tell us why one of us might not make it home if we get in an accident, and why it was me and not you and not you and not you. So there's a mystery there somewhere. We haven't figured it out, but it requires faith in something larger than ourselves.
So along those lines, I wonder, with all of your study, vast study of how the West has gone astray over the years, and we talk about this faith element, it sounded in your talk as if you're somewhat resistant to maybe Charles Murray's argument that kind of post-1960s humanism, that a lot of white America in particular abandoned morality, abandoned certain traditions and norms, and that you feel that there's been more of an economic cause and effect, deindustrialization, globalization. But the moral relativism had to come from somewhere first. That created both the cultural problem and some of the economic problems. Where did that come from, and how do we put that genie back in the bottle?
Well, I think what happened was, in the 1960s in particular, and it happened in Britain right after World War I with the modernist and France. People looked toward the elite for guidance, whether they should or not, and we can define elite by meritocratic achievement or wealth or birth, whatever way. But once the elite adapts a code of behavior, that starts to filter down. The reason that people like Downton Abbey, I mean, it's kind of a corny thing, but the one reason people liked it, they didn't say to themselves, these people are snobbish. They had concern and empathy for their employees. They were always engaged in good work. They wanted to be clean. They wanted to look nice. They had a code that was destroyed after World War I. And when that code is destroyed and it filters down to the lower classes that have no margin of error, it becomes absolutely destructive. If you've got a trust fund, or you have a nice home, or you live in a nice area, or you have a nice job title, and you have a couple of kids out of wedlock and you take drugs, you might be able to get by. But when that model is adopted by people with no more, it's absolutely destructive. And so I think the norms were destroyed in the 60s, and that generation did okay, but the people who emulated them didn't. And so it's a cat chasing its tail. It's cause and effect. I don't believe that everybody was living in trailers, shooting up with drugs, and therefore a steel company just said, I'm not going to hire these people. I think there were other incentives as well, but it's hard to chart which caused which because they worked in tandem.
A negative feedback loop to some degree.
Yeah.
Let's talk something optimistic and promising, if we can do this. Do you believe that there's a pendulum that is at risk, and I use risk here in a right tail sense, upside risk, pendulum swinging the other way? Has the left gone too far?
Yeah, I think it has. It's contrary to nature. It's contrary to human nature.
Yeah.
So we know that. We all know it deep down in our heart. And when LeBron James, for example, who lives in a $42 million home and has 8 security guards, when he lectures how unfair this country is, or when he says we need more diversity and there's 75% African American and the most undiverse employment agency in the world, the NBA, or when Jane Fonda says, thank God for COVID, it really gave liberalism a second wind. So we know that this bankrupt media. So what I'm optimistic about is, take this election, whatever your feelings about Trump are, there are millions of people who feel the country is toxic and they want to save it, and they have no allies. They don't have the media, they don't have Hollywood, they don't have entertainment, they don't have professional sports, they don't have academic, they don't have K through 12. Tell me they don't have who do they have? They only have themselves. And yet, they're this close from destroying this whole progressive 16-year idea. And if you listen to what Obama and Clinton were saying, they said there's 16 years we can solve the problem and give us, pretty much state socialism. So I don't know how they did it, but it's remarkable that the innovativeness of the human spirit. And we had no resources at all. Look at the Fortune 400 and look at the great wealths in America. They're all on the left now. And yet, these people they can't be stopped. And so I'm very optimistic. And what do they want? They want to be left alone. They want to follow the Constitution. They want to better their own lives. They want to have property. They want to have the Second Amendment. They want to have the First Amendment. They want to treat people based on their character. They don't want to have the state interfere in their lives. And if they do well, they want to help somebody who didn't do well. And they think they can do that a lot better than the government. And they can. So I'm very optimistic about that.
That DNA of the American idea,
Yes.
You believe is still there, and we have to fight to preserve it, but you don't feel that it's lost.
I am. One of the things we live in a community that's about 85% Mexican American, and it's been ground zero of the most late immigration from Oaxaca, Mexico. So it's a very different immigration than the earlier immigrations. But I'm always struck by Mexican American people I went to high school with, and I still live in this community, and they're saying to me, when are we going to close the border? Because my nephew is married to a white guy, my cousin's married to a black guy. This is what we're supposed to do. Why do we just let one group come illegally across the border? And then they say things that just astound me. If they come here, why don't they like America? I said they do like America, but they're told by wealthy white people not to like America.
That's right. Exactly.
But what I'm getting at is I think there's a conservative renaissance that's happening among non-traditional conservatives. It's very small now. I don't think Donald Trump is going to get a large. I think if he got 20% of the African, that would be stunning. If he got 35% of the so-called Latino vote, but he's going to get a larger. And this is what I'll leave you with on this question. He's going to get a larger percentage than John McCain or Mitt Romney, and both of them, the late McCain and Romney, would say he's a racist, and he's not. And the reason that he's going to get a larger percentage is Mitt Romney could never say to people, our farmers, our workers, use the first person possessive pronoun. I never heard him say that, our. I think he wanted to say it. But how odd that a crass, crude billionaire from the Manhattan real estate world could go out into all of these communities and appeal to people. It's very strange.
So there's a couple questions on the college front, and they're sort of separate, but I'm going to combine them just because I'm trying to get as many people's questions covered. The student debt crisis you talked about, I think it's an economic 1.6 trillion crisis, but it's also a moral crisis, how we got here, the hubris of university presidents to allow it. What is the solution to student debt that is not in the Elizabeth Warren playbook, but in the Dr. Hanson playbook? And then more specifically, we talk about Hillsdale, but for the parents in the room thinking about colleges for their children, to the extent that there's some parents that still do care about what gets taught in the classrooms at college, besides Hillsdale, what would be another example of a college you might recommend out there? Very hard to get to Hillsdale.
Yeah, I mean, there's not very many, is there? There's St. Thomas Aquinas, sometimes St. John. I think Pepperdine's gone to the left. But you have a great problem because the way everybody wants the best for their child. And universities are like cattle brands now. So when you send your kid to Stanford or Harvard or Yale, you know they're going to be indoctrinated, they're going to be educated less well than at Hillsdale, but they're going to get a brand on them, just like a double bar X or something, and that's called a Harvard. So you can't tell your child, I don't want you indoctrinated and I don't want you poorly taught at Stanford, when you know that he'll be poorly taught and indoctrinated, but he'll have a pathway that he wouldn't have somewhere else. So there's two solutions to this. One is if your child goes to a prestigious school that will enhance whatever his particular ideas about his future are, then you have to be very careful. He has to pick, and every one of these universities, Stanford I can tell you because I know most about it, 5% of the faculty are wonderful and 5% who are left-wing don't indoctrinate. So there's 10%, and a person can find them. And there's students there, and they can have an oasis. But other than that, Hillsdale and St. John's or any school that has a traditional curriculum, as far as we know, the sad thing about the higher education, we know how to fix it because we know what it used to be like. And we know that in the 50s and 60s, it was entirely liberal, but it wasn't hard left. I don't think I had one conservative professor, undergraduate or graduate, but I had a lot. I think I only had one that I would call unprofessional. They were all liberals, but they never indoctrinated us. They would kid you if you were conservative, but it didn't matter to your grade. They let people come on campus of all different types, and when people disrupted during the 1970s, they were appalled by it. And that's gone. So how do we get it back very quickly? I think one thing is the universities, if they want these student loans and they want to hire all these administrators of inclusion and diversity and equity and rock climbing walls, and let them pay for it. And they can do that by they have to guarantee their own loans. And once they did that and the federal government got out of it, they would be really cost conscious. They couldn't afford what they're doing because they assume that the government's going to pick up the default. And second,
Well, and they'd have to compete over price, with price.
They would. And then why in the world, after, let's say, a certain ratio, but why if Stanford's got $34 billion endowment, why can't we just say the first $2 billion is tax deductible or not subject to income tax on the revenue, but why isn't the other? And that would, there was some movement, as you know, in the tax reform bill of 2018. So I think we could look at that. Why in the world, when you graduate and you want to be a high school teacher, do you have to be credentialed? You don't have to be credentialed to go to junior college. So suddenly at 17, everybody has to have somebody to go to these awful school of education and be credentialed. Then they go to a JC and all of a sudden they have an MA. So why not give every kid that graduates a choice if they want to be a high school teacher? You can go through that awful education indoctrination to get a credential and get an MA. 1 year and learn history or English or science. And I think most students would take the MA in a second, and that would shut down that's where the problem at K through 12 is. And finally, I thought about this, and this gets the most anger if I had this conversation. If you notice that, well, now we're going to get rid of ACT and SAT eventually because it's considered discriminatory. Remember where it started. The SAT test started to end discrimination, mostly against Jews, because they were discriminated, and we wanted to find a blind method of assessing knowledge that didn't have the old boy system. But the university today says, we can't trust you guys from Selma High School. I know that I had a straight A average when I wanted to go to university, and somebody from Palo Alto High had a straight A average, and that was considered better. It probably was. So then we corrected for that with the SAT. The idea was, we don't trust the high schools. That's what the colleges were telling us, so we have our own standard. Why don't we say we don't trust the colleges? Yeah. And so when you graduate, you all have to take the SAT again, and let's say you're going to have a minimum grade score. Yeah. Yeah. And you know what would happen? Hillsdale students would all pass, and I think Stanford's would flunk. So, and it would cut out a lot. So I think they should do that as well.
I was going to try to avoid the topic primarily because I'm making sure that everything I ask you are things I know we're fully aligned on, you and me. And this big tech issue is a tough one for, you mentioned Milton Friedman in your talk, a kind of free marketeer like myself. But it's a real problem. I hear you with Tucker frequently talk about it. But because I got a second question on it, I have to go there. Thoughts on big tech as an antithesis to liberty, the Orwellian reality, but how we want to think about that from a distinctly Western standpoint and the complexity of technology and what's happening.
Well, we were talking about this, my wife and I, so I said, let's just play a little game this week. So I said, let's text Hunter, Biden, and Russia. And I read the search order. How many searches did you have to go to the word scandal came? It was 5 pages till I saw the word scandal. It was Russian disinformation used by Republicans, every single one of these searches. And then it was funny, you finally got to the point where nobody ever heard of these platforms. They weren't in the New York Times. So you know that they're using logarithms to adjudicate these searches. You know they're canceling people, they're deplatforming. And I know that when I'm at Stanford University and I write something, I can't get too detailed because of professional considerations, but I will get calls from people at Stanford or Hoover and say, we got to call Victor. And that means, ding, somebody in big tech is saying, I'm going to yank money if you let that SOB write another column. They have enormous power, and they're very brilliant. I know a lot of them. I talk to them a lot. Not the high, but the mid-level. And what they've done is brilliant. They've navigated the political maelstorms perfectly. On the one hand, they've told the conservatives, you guys believe in free market economics. We're your Thomas Edison, we're your Alexander Graham Bell, we're your Carnegies, we're the guys that are, up from our bootstraps. We're the robber barons. We're the guys that make stuff. You don't want to kill us, regulate us to death. And then they go over to the left and they say, we're giving all the money to you. We're warping these companies to give you political, and these stupid conservatives are giving us the rope to hang themselves. And that's how they do it. And so I guess it depends on whether you think it's a public utility or not. How essential to your life, when you turn on the lights, Public Utilities Commission has some say. I don't think they do a very good job. When you hear a radio and you hear that bleep, or on TV that FCC doesn't like people to say certain words, they feel those public airways belong to everybody. And when you take a truck and you go between one state and another, the tires and everything is regulated. And whether you think I think an internet search is pretty essential to your existence. And so I've changed 180 degrees on this subject. I got to the point where I feel that they are Orwellian. And when I go on and buy something on Amazon, and I've forgotten what I buy, and then for the next 10 days on a Google search, these things pop up, you bought tennis shoes, and here's 10 tennis shoes, and here's tennis shoes, and it's crazy, the power they have and the intrusiveness. So I think they need to be reeled in a little bit.
So, Victor, how do we reel them in without giving more power to the administrative state?
It's a very hard question. I
just wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy.
It's a very hard question. I think you have to have some type of public, a board that's public, but they will have regulators working for them. And they brought it on themselves, and they knew it was coming, and they thought, you know what, when we had market capitalization of $500 million or $1 billion or $10 billion, we were scared, but now we have $4 trillion in Silicon. We don't think anybody would be stupid enough to take us on, and so they become arrogant and dangerous, I think. And I don't have it. We go back and forth on these public utilities. I think it was really good to deregulate the airlines in one sense, and then on the other, there were downsides to it. Cheaper fares for everybody, but service and certain things. So we do regulate the airlines in some ways. There's certain times a plane cannot stand on the tarmac without getting fined, and there are certain rules about the ticketing, but there are no rules.
They have a lot of rules in Orange County to protect the sleepyheads.
Yeah. But we don't
really
have
unfair to those of us who actually travel for business.
I don't know why all of a sudden I woke up one morning and I did an apolitical Prager University Korean War, and it was deplatformed.
Yeah.
I don't know why all of a sudden I did an Uncommon Knowledge not long ago, and it was deplatformed. And I don't know why all of a sudden a bunch of techie people said that I should be fired from the Hoover because I questioned Anthony Fauci in an op-ed. But that's what they do. They do it every day. And they don't do it by what we think they do. They do it by calling people up at your employer and then telling them that they have so much money and influence, and they love Stanford University, but they have these, that's what they do.
So there's a certain sense of injustice in what many of us who love the American idea are facing now. And I bring up the word justice because I'm going to use it as our last question tonight. And actually, I don't think he wrote his name on the card, so I don't think he minds me saying it comes from Mayor O'Neill. If our state senator, John Morlock, had a question tonight, he didn't write his name on the card. So if I didn't get to yours, I apologize. But thank you, John, for being here. And hi, Trina. But Mayor O'Neill has a question, and I think it ties into this issue that has really become a major 2020 item for discussion. And I think it does stem out of the great progress over of the West in the couple millennia you're talking about, and that's the issue of justice. And like many concepts and ideas, when it gets defined wrongly, the applications seem to me to be borderline tragic. And this summer, I saw things that struck me as really unjust that were being done in the name of justice. And it just seemed to me to be a total bastardization of the moral virtue of justice. Is justice what the West is about? And can we reclaim not just the word, but the concept for those of us who not only believe in a free and virtuous society, but a distinctly Christian one? Who is talking about justice in a way that would pass metal for those of our worldview?
The idea of justice, dike in Greek, it was a deity with a blindfold, and then justia in Rome. And the idea was you had to apply, that was what made Rome different than all of its rivals. It applied justice blindly, and it worshiped, and the Byzantine Empire was the same way. It worshiped the Justinian law code, not individual. And that's what our country was founded. We haven't been just always on the base of sex and race, but we've always understood that when we weren't, there were enough people here that said that was wrong. What's I find right now the most dangerous threat to justice is the substitution of the law for a perceived moral good or a moral superiority, whether it's a Supreme Court ruling or the unwillingness to prosecute the law based on your sense of own individual morality. And what that means is that you don't have a law. So if you're a shop, I went to Seattle 3 weeks ago, and I drove through the CHOP area that was declared an independent autonomous state. There was no law there, and now it's gone, and all of these stores have been destroyed. And I get all these photos and emails from people in Minneapolis, and all of the people say the same thing. The police did not enforce the law. The district attorneys do not enforce the law. And not long ago, the state of California said, we're going to have an amnesty. I think it was $100 million for traffic. Anybody who has traffic tickets can get amnestied, and we did. And now we have, I think we're back up to $100 million and people not paying. And so there's a sense of, one, that the law is not applied to crimes in the way it should be, and more importantly, it's not applied equally. And we are the most, I'll give you an example of what I mean to finish. California is the most hyper-regulated and hypo-regulated. By that I mean, if I go to Palo Alto, I've talked to people where the state will come in, the city will actually make them tear down a mailbox in Atherton if it's 2 inches too short. I was going into Stanford one day, and a landscaper ahead of me had a smoky tailpipe, something I see every day in Salma. I was laughing about it. I got to my office, and my assistant said, "Were you on Sarah Drive?" And I said, "Yes." "Did you hear that, smell that car?" And I said, "What car?" "It's every day in Selma." He said, "Well, I called in to report, and I was number 17. The police said. Well, that was the Palo Alto society reacting to that, and they fined that guy. But where I live, there is no law. There is no law. The person across the street has 7 Winnebagos. They're all illegal. Romex watches. Romex wire goes to them. There's 40 dogs. I got bit by one. I called the sheriff. They didn't come. I called the SPCA, and they said, "Did you go to the owner?" I said, "Yes." They said, "What did he do?" I said, "He slammed the door, and then second dog bit me, and worse than the first." And so I called the sheriff back, and I said, "Well, are you ever going, it's against the law." And I said, "What would happen if my dog, who's licensed and went out in the street and bit somebody, they would fine me?" And he just said, "Yeah, we'd fine them." And so I called my physician. He said, "Well, the good news is only 6 people got rabies out of 1 million dog bites last year, and we think they were mostly bats and not dogs. But in Mexico, there were 40. So if the dog came from Mexico, I'd get a rabies shot, but it might make you sick." But he said, on the other hand, if you get rabies, you're dead. But I would suggest, don't get the shot. And so that's how the law is applied. I spend most of my time picking up wet garbage. out in front of my yard, and finally somebody's stupid enough to put the power bill in it, right? So I go to the person's address and I throw the garbage back, and they call the police. So what I'm getting at is that this country now has decided to use social justice as a criterion to enforce the law. So we'd say a DA is not going to arrest 450 people that caused destruction in Portland because they were doing a particular good to society. Or what, 1,000 healthcare workers, doctors, nurses signed a petition that said if you went out and protest and shouted and spitted and didn't have a mask and didn't social, that was good for the health of you. And you should be exempt from protocol. But if you're a small owner, and you have no money, and you have a hamburger stand, they're going to arrest you. And so that unequal application of the law based on an enlightened progressive's idea of social justice is what's going to destroy the law. And it's scary, because all of us think, you know what, I mean, the conversation we have in rural California is there's so much crime here. I talk to neighbors and people, what would be the pros and cons of shooting somebody who breaks into your home? And everybody said, well, if you shot them, you'd probably get sued and lose everything. On the other hand, maybe if you shot them in the leg, they wouldn't get too mad. Or are they going to kill you? But maybe they just stab you and you could live. But that's what people talk about. And it's scary. It really is. And I think all of you who have done well and feel that you're not victims, then you're by definition victimizers. You have a target on your back. If you're an employee, you're going to get sued or you're going to do something. And that's really scary, because you see the law will be, it's relative, it's not absolute anymore. And the courts have done a lot of it, but the progressives have done a lot. The non-enforcement of the law, whether it's immigration law or other crime laws, is destroying it, the sanctity of the law.
But is that political, or is it philosophical? Is that bastardized view of justice and application that you're talking about? Some of the stories are almost borderline humorous if they weren't so tragic, but that application that we can all agree is prima facie unjust. Is that a byproduct of political progressivism, or is there some sort of lacking foundation in better understanding the concept of justice?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know, but I think part of it is it's psychological, and by that I mean what's happened in America is we have been so lax in the application of the law because we felt in some ways we were illiberal in the past. We had an ism or an ology, we were sexist or homophobic or racist, and now we want to atone. We don't want to atone and suffer ourselves. We want to atone collectively, but make you suffer. And that's the problem. Mark Zuckerberg's really angry about illegal immigration and poor people who are sent back to Mexico, but he's got one of the nicest walls around his home in Palo Alto that you could build. So what I'm getting at is what's happened is psychologically we've adopted this, what is it, medieval penance? So if you want to build, if you're a sinner or you're an usurer in 15th century Rome and you want to go to heaven, then you write out a contract and you can put one block on the dome of the St. Peter's, then you can go to heaven. Well, we do it in a different way. We're abstractly moral, and then we can be concretely amoral. Or in the law enforcement, we feel good about enforcing the misdemeanor, but we neglect the felony. I got pulled over going 8 miles over out in the middle of nowhere in the west side, and a highway patrolman pulled me over. I said, I'm only going 8 miles, right? Not. He said, well, you're going 8 miles over. And, and as we were talking, a person went 120 miles. And he said, would you stay right here off the record? And I said, well, no, he said, please stay right there. So he went and came back 20 minutes later, and I was there, and he said, I'm going to reduce that by 3 miles. You're fine. But my point is, I could go on, but we put solar panels on a barn that was built in a shed that was, part of it had been an older structure, and it took us 6 months. And they kept coming, where's the map? I said it was ag exempt. Well, show me that it was ag exempt. So I had to dig up all of these old documents. This went on for 6 months. before they would, and then the thing had been brought up to code. I said, is there anything wrong with the building? He said, it's a beautiful building. It's all up to code, but we want the permit. I said, there was no law that you had to have a permit when it was built. And he said, well, we got to bring it up. I said, it's up to code. We went through this, and I said, could you just walk out to the road, look across the street? I said, there's chickens in the middle of the street. There's 40 porta potties all over that 5 acres with the hole cut out of the porta potty, so people are defecating in the ground. We haven't had that in 40 years. There's no mosquito abatement. There's all this stagnant water. There's no electricity is being stolen off the PG&E pole. I said, the whole thing is a complete disaster. You know what he said to me? Where would I start when I went over there? And he said, nobody has any money. Nobody would communicate. And next thing I know, I would be in the Fresno Bee. He said that. I'd be in the Fresno Bee as someone who was causing trouble for poor people. So I said, so you come over here and I'm going to nod, make you feel really good, and I'm going to follow every little rule, and you can go back and say you regulated a guy, and I'll pay that. And he said, yeah. And I did. And I got even more cynical and bitter, just like you do.
Well, I've hosted. I think I've hosted at least 3 or 4 Q&As with Dr. Hanson over the years, and I've just learned what category to not bring up to try to wrap things up. To bid us adieu this evening, I'm going to invite up to the stage the president of the board of trustees at Pacifica, and one of my very closest friends, and one of the only 2 Bruins in my life, Keith Carlson.